everybody. Thanks for coming. So my name's Casey, and I'm going to talk to you guys about how to structure teams and how to think about supply in your marketplaces. I originally called this something around like decentralization, but I was afraid it was going to get a bunch of blockchain geeks in the audience. This is not a presentation about blockchain. So if that's what you care about, you're in the wrong room. So first, a little bit about me. So I help primarily marketplaces and network-driven businesses scale. So as an employee, I led the growth team at Pinterest. I started the marketing team at Grub Hub. I was a growth advisor in residence at Greylock Partners, and I started my career as an analyst at Apartments.com. And now I work as an advisor to a lot of marketplace and network-driven businesses like Eventbrite, Lyft, Thumbtack, et cetera. So we're going to talk about today are kind of a lot of the common questions I receive from founders about how to structure their marketplace and their org design. Some case studies from my experience with Grub Hub, Lyft, Airbnb, and Eventbrite on how to solve some of these problems, and then just some best practice guidelines for you to take away as to how you should think about this when you experience these pain points. So some of the questions I receive a lot is like, okay, I'm expanding into a market. Who actually owns the market success on my team? Or who owns a country's growth when I grow into it? Or I have these local people. Who do they actually report to in my organization? I have some supply that's doing some crazy shit. Like, do I want that kind of variability in my marketplace, or do I want to kind of clamp down and set like a strict standard of service that we provide on the supply side? So how you should in general think about answering these questions is, okay, who actually has the expertise in my organization or outside my organization, and what will enable me to drive the best execution for this problem? And I'll get into a bunch of examples of how this works in practice. So first, I'm going to talk about some experience I had working with Lyft as a client. So if you guys remember in the early days of Uber and Lyft, they were one of the first companies that really had a marketplace where a local GM owned a market success. So why did they do this? Well, the first reason is that they had to do a lot of work locally on the supply on the ground. So they had to train, drivers on the level of service they wanted. They had to inspect the cars to make sure they were actually going to be fit to drive people around. And then once they had the supply, they were essentially paying for the supply to exist, giving them hourly rates. So they needed to kind of do guerrilla warfare to attract demand to make sure these drivers just weren't sitting, in their cars doing nothing. So originally when they started, Uber and Lyft had a very decentralized model to the supply side. Local people are going to take care of it for us. The HQ can worry about other things. But as they kept this model and they scaled, they started to run into a lot of challenges. So as you build up more people in your headquarters that have like deep expertise in, let's say, paid acquisition to acquire drivers, incentivize referral programs to acquire demand, and then they're waiting for the local GM to tell them what to do, even though they know more about this problem than the local GM. That's a problem. And as the local GMs kept trying to own demand, these scrappy tests that they did to drive initial liquidity in the market didn't scale as well as what people in the headquarters were trying to do. So over time, Uber and Lyft centralized a lot of these functions away from a local general manager into someone in HQ with more expertise. However, when you think about standard of service, variety of supply, Uber and Lyft very quickly learned to centralize this and really standardize it. Why did they do that? Well, I think they realized very early, like if you were very early to Lyft, you probably got one of those like party cars that was like super crazy. But pretty quickly, both services realized that like consistency is one of the value props. I want to get a car quickly. I want it to get me from A to B as fast as possible and as cheap as possible. So any kind of variety in the ride is something that is a negative, not a positive in terms of the value prop to the demand side. Now, a bunch of these businesses tested a lot of new models, but what they would do is they would test that in a local market, pretty quickly find out if they had product market fit, and then they would standardize it across markets. So this is, Uber Pool and Lyft Line. Test in one market, okay, figure out what works, scale it, and standardize it as a specific product. Uber Eats, test it in one market, standardize that product, scale it elsewhere. So from very early on variety of supply, Uber and Lyft had a centralized point of view on what type of variety they wanted in their supply and how to standardize that across the different markets. Very different from how they handled like supply onboarding, for example, or early demand. Okay, so that's an example from working with Lyft. How about Grub Hub? Grub Hub had some very different problems in terms of figuring out who had the expertise in driving some of these things. So in terms of getting supply in the early days, Grubhub decided to build out a local sales team. Now, why did they do that? Well, we had no clue which restaurants delivered. We had no clue which of those restaurants were good. We had no clue which neighborhoods had people that would actually want to order food from us. So we hired local people who could figure that out for us. So this was a very decentralized approach. Hey, we have people we hired in the market. They're going to figure this stuff out for us. But eventually, over time, we ended up moving to all inside sales, inside our headquarters. Why did we do that? Well, eventually, we figured out better processes to figure out which restaurants actually mattered that would end up driving demand. Thanks Yelp, a huge valuable database for us to mine to get some of that information. And then we were able to use a lot of demographic and psychographic data available from different sources to figure out which neighborhoods to launch in next, so that we, launch in places where people would likely order food and avoid places where people wouldn't. We're also able to develop a lot of playbooks around sales that we could, test and iterate on very quickly in a phone sales environment because we had a bunch of central people who could share tactics fairly easily. And that became as effective, if not more effective, than going into the restaurant and talking to the owner directly. And then if we did need to go into a market and actually do kind of boots on the ground stuff, we just take some of our best inside salespeople and we do what we call paratrooping, which is fly them out to the market, have them meet a bunch of restaurateurs face to face, sign contracts, come back, and then use that to kind of bootstrap inside sales again. So over time, Grubhub centralized its supply acquisition strategy away from local people to inside sales. Now, on the demand side, however, we basically started running demand from HQ. Now, why do we do that? We figured out that there's actually demand for food delivery on search engines, and SEO and SEM are much better handled from HQ with a centralized strategy. SEO, the more landing pages you create that link to each other, the better you're going to rank on everything. On SEM, it's better to have a subject matter expert that's like scaling those campaigns across market by market. There's not a whole lot that's going to be super different on a geo by geo basis in terms of getting the best CPA, getting the best landing pages, all of that stuff. What we also found, surprisingly, is that our offline marketing tactics were very similar from market to market. So transit ads ended up being a very successful strategy for us to acquire demand. And it turns out that, I got to figure out how this is supposed to work. Am I doing this right? Yeah. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. So as we started doing transit advertising, we realized, well, we actually get better rates by negotiating all of these things across markets because there's just a few companies that own all the inventory across all cities that do out-of-home and transit. And what we essentially realized is like, hey, as long as we get enough restaurants, all of these tactics are going to work super well. So we had a very centralized approach to demand, and this was actually the team that I ran at Grubhub. But compared to Uber and Lyft, we actually allowed a lot of variety in our supply. So why do we do that? Well, variety is one of the value props of Grubhub. People want different types of cuisines. They want to be at different price points. They want to be able to order at different times of the day, days of week, etc. So variety is a feature, not a bug of the marketplace. So we wanted to keep that. Also, all the restaurants we were signing up in the early days did their own delivery. So we just kind of said, hey, you're already taking delivery orders. Here's extra demand. Go fulfill it. And obviously some restaurants were better at doing their own delivery than others. But what we would do is we would use ratings from our demand side to figure out who was actually not good at delivery or not actually providing good enough food on an objective basis. And we would just kick them off the platform. So we had, even though we're decentralized, we had like a checks and balances to make sure that like it didn't ruin the quality of the overall marketplace. So Grubhub had a very decentralized approach, saying, hey, supply, you figure out what you want to offer. That variety is a great thing for our marketplace. We don't want to standardize this in any way. But what's happened more recently after Grubhub has gone public is they have started to standardize the delivery experience a little bit more. So why would they make that change? Well, what happened is we essentially signed up every restaurant that did its own delivery in the US. So the only way to grow the supply side and have more variety for the demand side is to start providing that service. And what we were having is a bunch of restaurants were coming to us saying, hey, we want to participate on Grubhub. And we like, do you have any delivery drivers? And they'd be like, no. And it was like, Well, we don't have any delivery drivers either. What do you want to do? So eventually we built those, we built up that capacity and that skill set ourselves to be able to do delivery for restaurants. And now a significant percentage of deliveries on Grub Hub are actually going through Grub Hub's delivery network instead of the restaurant's own delivery network. So this is now a mixed model. Some of it is centralized, some of it is decentralized, and it's moved to more mixed over time. Okay, let's talk Airbnb. It's another company I worked with. So, and let's talk about variety of supply again. Initially, Airbnb had a lot of supply variety. Now, why would they do that? Essentially, they were creating a new market, and they felt the locals would have a better idea of how to create a good experience than the actual founders of the business. So what actually emerged is that the uniqueness of these places and of these hosts became a value prop of the service. So like, oh, I'm staying in a treehouse, or you're like, oh, this host is super awesome. Like he plays in a band, he took me out to a show, whatever, right? So this allowing that variety of supply in the early days became an overall value prop for people to try Airbnb. And then these hosts would sort of share some learnings with each other to help them be more effective over time. So there was a bit of community on the supply side. So this was a very decentralized approach to thinking about like the variety and quality of supply. But if you've used Airbnb more recently, you'll start to know that they've been standardizing this over time. Now, why would they do that? Well, when you have, I think, something like 500 million guests come through the platform, you learn a lot about what they want, a lot more than the individual host on your platform. And if you're able to leverage that data, you can say, hey, I get that you have this cool little thing, but I actually know what people want. So if you want good ratings, if you want more bookings, you should do these things. They also have a bunch of aggregate pricing data across the market. So they, while you initially might have priced your extra room at $50 a night, they can actually tell you, oh, you'll get the same amount of demand if you price it at 67 or whatever the case may be. So helping hosts be more successful. Now, what do they do when they start to centralize more supply? Do they kick off people who won't conform to their needs? No, they use a carrot approach, not a stick approach. So essentially what they do is they say, hey, if you accept bookings instantly, instead of kind of, having to check your calendar every time, we'll feature you as an instant book host. And we're going to push you higher in the search results. You're going to get more business. And more recently, they've launched the Airbnb Plus tier, which is having a higher level of service, more akin to a hotel. And again, you're going to push higher in search results. You're going to get more business. And now you've probably heard stuff in the news, how they're considering having sponsored and owned properties for Airbnb, taking even more control of the entire experience on the supply side. It's not actually clear that this is the right strategy for Airbnb. If we, last slide, we talked about uniqueness, one of the value props. If you standardize the supply too much, you might lose one of the value props that people are actually coming to Airbnb for. So it'll be interesting to see how this strategy plays out for them. But what you can see is they've moved to more of a mixed model in terms of how they think about variety of supply. Okay, lastly, I'll give some examples from my time working with Eventbrite. What's really interesting about Eventbrite is that when they launched, they essentially outsourced driving demand to their suppliers. So why would they do that? Well, it turns out their initial customers are event promoters. What do event promoters know how to do? They know how to promote their events. They know how to promote their events way better than Eventbrite does. So Eventbrite's just saying, hey, we're going to power the tickets. You do you. You'll bring in the demand. What's really interesting thing that happened, and I think Brian Rothenberg talked about this earlier today, is that people who buy tickets actually learn about Eventbrite as a service. And it turns out event promoters go to more events per year than non-event promoters. So then a bunch of them were like, oh, this Eventbrite thing is cool. I'll use this for my next event. So this was an extremely decentralized approach to driving demand for their business. But what happened is eventually Eventbrite started to lean into driving demand on its own. Now, why did they do that? Well, it turns out if hundreds of thousands of event promoters link to you so that they can fulfill their tickets, you build up a lot of domain authority for SEO, which means you can rank when people are searching for things to do in San Francisco pool parties, you name it. So there's a large SEO opportunity. They started leaning into that to drive incremental demand for their suppliers. Also, when you start gathering hundreds of thousands of events in your inventory, it opens up a lot of partnership opportunities that your individual event promoter can't get into, like an integration with Facebook events or an integration with Spotify, all things that Eventbrite has done. What Eventbrite was also finding is that once consumers had gone to a bunch of events through Eventbrite, if they were bored and wanted to find something to do, they would come to Eventbrite and search for things to do. So now you have all this kind of organic demand coming in. Leaning into that, building a stronger like consumer product can help drive incremental demand as well. So now Eventbrite's in this mixed model. Event promoters are still promoters. They're going to drive a lot of their own demand. But now Eventbrite is a very real assistance to demand for them, which is an even stronger value prop than they were before, just as a ticketing platform. The other interesting thing is Eventbrite has now built development offices across the world. So a question they had is like, okay, now that we have these structures, who should these people report to? So what we decided is that if you have functional roles with enough people in them, like a bunch of engineers, you can actually build out a local management team. You can have an engineering manager, an engineering director, et cetera. But we had a lot of roles where there's only like 1 or 2 people in that local office. It doesn't make sense to hire, a manager on top of them. So we did, if you have just like 1 product manager or 1 designer, they essentially have a local manager who is, someone that's kind of like running the office. They might not actually have expertise in what that person does. And then they also have a functional manager in HQ that's tying them to the strategy, how to be a good product manager, designer, et cetera. So there's a dual structure there. So this is kind of a mixed model of kind of decentralized, some people in HQ taking the ownership and some people in the local office taking the ownership over the issue. Okay. So based on a lot of experience at these companies and others, I just have a few common kind of questions and answers that I'll run through, and then we'll get to questions. So the first is kind of who should own a market launch and what is their goal? This is a common one I have to deal with companies with. So if you're an early stage company and you don't have a playbook on how to grow different cities, different markets, different countries, then hire a local leader, tell them to figure it out with their goal being driving liquidity. Like, how do I get supply and demand to match and grow that? If you're a little bit later stage and you've actually developed a playbook on how to consistently launch markets, then usually a person in HQ manages that from HQ, and they might be able to do a bunch of different markets at the same time. And their goal is overall scale of each market they launch. They know they have a playbook to get the liquidity, so it's about how fast they can bend this curve and how big they can grow the market. Another question is, if you're having local leaders, what should they actually own? So if the market's truly unique, like we have this challenge with Japan in a lot of the companies I work with, very unique market, you end up having a local leader in charge of market growth. But if the market's not unique, if it's very similar to markets that you've launched and scaled in the past, then the local leader just has certain levers that they control and certain levers that they're more of an execution layer for. So an example of some things you might own as a local leader in this scenario is local partnerships that will drive supplier demand, training your supply, local feedback to the HQ on like what's working and not working about the product that might need to be tweaked and the product team needs to learn about. And at the execution layer, you're probably not driving the PR strategy or the content marketing strategy, but you might be an execution layer, translating that into the local language or talking to the local press. And lastly, another one is kind of, is this supply variability a feature or a bug in the marketplace? Do I want this or do I want to remove this? So the questions you should answer are like, what is the demand side actually valuing? Do they have a homogeneous need or do they have different needs? And if they have different needs, can I standardize those into specific products or not? And if you can't standardize those products and there isn't a homogeneous need, then you will allow the supply to have a little bit more control over what can happen in the marketplace. But if you can standardize that into your UberX and your Uber pool and all of that, you'll start to take a little bit more control over what products are actually available on the supply side of your marketplace. The last question, I think this is the last question, who should manage local team members? So if they're operational or their focus is on the actual locale, then usually you're going to have an operational team locally with an operational leader in HQ. For Pinterest, for example, we had a head of international in HQ and all the local GMs reported to that person. But if they're technical, then the question you should ask is how many? If it's a lot, then you probably have a local manager, like for engineering, reporting to an HQ leader. And if it's not a lot, like you have one product manager or something in that office, they'll have a local manager that's usually like the site manager, and then also a functional manager that's helping them grow their career, connect them to the strategy, et cetera. And that's all the stuff I have. I have a lot more stuff on growth and marketplaces at my blog, and feel free to follow me on Twitter for more short form musings. With that, I'll take questions.
So some of the changes, what's the timing of them? So for example,
Yep.
you're building local liquidity, and at some point you have to kind of grow up.
Yeah.
How do you know when the time is?
Yeah, great question. So the question is, when you're transforming from trying to build local liquidity, which is managed by a local team, to trying to scale that liquidity, when do you think about making the change from the local team handling it to now the HQ transferring ownership? So the simple way to answer this is as soon as you have liquidity, and as soon as you have people in HQ who have more expertise in how to grow the market than the local person. So in the case of, if you had a perfectly optimal team, you'd be like, okay, dump local smart person in there. They do a bunch of scrappy work to get supply and demand to work. You start to see the cross-site network effect emerge. Boom. As soon as that, you flip to local people. But in a lot of marketplaces, if you try to do that, you might not have the people in HQ that have the expertise on how to take it over from that person. So more so what you do in practice is you have your local person take care of it until it's very clear you have people in HQ that know more about how to do this. And then there's this kind of gradual exchange. So in the Lyft example, it's like, okay, everything GM focused. Let's get this thing going. Let's send out a bunch of emails about how the Warriors are great and all this stuff. And then there's like, oh, now we have hired this awesome performance marketer. Maybe we can peel away like driver acquisition from the GM. Oh, we now have like an incentivized referral program that's driving demand. Maybe we can say to the local GM, hey, don't bother trying to send out more promotion codes in San Francisco. Like, this is driving enough demand. And then eventually you're like, okay, like we've taken away most. Well, what actually happens is these GMs, if you expand this model well, these GMs have become like such good generalists that there's a lot of things they can transfer into HQ or start to manage teams of GMs. And that's kind of what happened due to the growth rate of Lyft and GM. So there wasn't a lot of firing. But there was a lot of politics until the career path was clear for those GMs, because they're used to having all this control. And now you're saying, no, we got smarter people who can take care of it now. And then they're like, wait, I'm not as important as I used to be. This sucks. So it's not an easy transition, but like as a founder or leader, you're trying to say like, okay, where's the expertise here? Like, is this still the best person that can grow this market, or has that shifted to some specialist, inside my company? And as soon as you see that, you need to like have the conversation on how to do that and build a playbook inside your company on how you're going to make that transition and what that new GM is going to do. Maybe they're happy to be that execution layer. Maybe they need to transition into something else.
What element drives like a centralized versus a decentralized model? So if you take a Lyft in New York, for instance, Lyft kind of doesn't work because there are the paid taxi drivers that drive the Lyft and Ubers, and they don't want the service, so they just ignore you. So can you combine the models with the centralized and the? I know you had the mixed model, but what factors kind of decide when to do the mix and when to do the other two?
Yeah, so we can go back. Whoop! That's not what I meant to do. Maybe I won't do that. Okay. I think this next one is mixed. Yeah. This is an example of ending in mixed as like a final state, or at least a current equilibrium. So the first question about Lyft like not working in New York. So one of the questions when you have to launch a market is you have to like get it to liquidity and get it to scale, which really is a product market fit problem. And what you find in most cases is like if it works in one city and you understand why it works in that city, you can apply 95% to the next city and make it work. But then there are truly unique markets where there's something about that market that breaks a thing in your playbook that gets you to essentially product market fit, or like to think of liquidity as product market fit for marketplaces. And in that case, what you're really trying to do is say like, okay, is this market important enough that I'm going to dedicate potentially product resources specifically to one market? So if you think about Facebook. Facebook scaled all across the world very quickly, but they realized that like Japan just did not work. So eventually they created a very specific team for Japan. They built a bunch of specific features for Japan to try to strengthen that product market fit and grow it faster. And they had some success doing that. Still wouldn't say it's their best market, but like it got better. So probably Lyft for New York, it's worth devoting some resources specifically to make New York, since New York is probably 20% of the ride sharing market in the US. But a lot of times you're going to be like, oh, it just doesn't work in like suburbia. Fuck it, like not enough market there for me to care about. Let me go just expand it into other kind of cities with enough density where this thing matters. And thinking about like the steady state of where you're going to be decentralized, centralized or a mixed model over time, pretty much all marketplaces trend towards more centralization over time when they're thinking about supply variety and when they're thinking about kind of growing individual markets. Because the beauty about marketplaces is they generate all this data and insight across all these different cities, across all these different users. And then the ability to apply that means just anyone looking at that data is smarter than anyone who isn't, which means it's smarter than your supply side. It's smarter than your local GMs who are only looking at one market. Which is actually kind of the opposite of what you do when you scale a business. You kind of push decision-making down because the people you hire end up being smarter than you and closer to the problem than you. So what ends up being the mixed model is like usually when there's like a different customer that you can start to serve, or you're kind of experimenting your way. Like, is Airbnb going to stay this, or are they going to move even more centralized and like remove all variety and it's going to be like a hotel brand in 5 years? I don't know. We'll see. All right, that's my time. So thanks everybody for coming.